The millstone and the crown. The tale of the free wind and the genius of Arkwright. If you thought the greatest villain in history was a king or a conqueror, you haven't yet met the man who figured out how to charge people for the air they breathed and the water that flowed. Chapter 1. The Wind's Common Right. The year is 1285. In the damp, fertile valleys of the Chiltern Hills, just west of the burgeoning, muck-filled city of London, the rhythm of life was ancient and agrarian. It was a life defined by the harvest, the church bells, and perhaps most profoundly, the ubiquitous presence of the mill. For centuries across the European continent, the grinding of grain, transforming hard kernels of wheat, rye, or barley into the flour necessary for the daily bread, was a fundamental and almost sacred communal act. And the power that drove this transformation was, for most, a gift of nature, the wind and the water. The technology was simple, yet profound. The watermill, harnessing the tireless flow of rivers, had been a fixture since Roman times, but it required a riverbank and a dam. The windmill, however, was a triumph of late medieval ingenuity, perfected in the flatlands of northern France and the Low Countries, before being imported to the British Isles. It required only a stretch of open land and a strong breeze. Crucially, in countless villages throughout England, the right to mill your own grain, the freedom to convert your personal harvest into sustenance, was known as the common right of grinding. This common right manifested in several forms. The simplest was the quernstone, a small hand-operated mill, little more than 2 circular stones that sat in the corner of a peasant's cottage. A family could spend an hour each evening turning the handle, and they would have their day's flour completely free of charge, owing nothing to anyone but their weary muscles. It was the ultimate food security. But for those who wished to save their labor, or for communities sharing the workload, there were also the free mills. These were often small, community-built, and operated by a local miller who charged only a small, customary fee, or multure, often paid not in coin, but in a fractional measure of the flour itself, a benign tax that kept the stones turning. The key was that the means of production, the power of nature, was considered public domain, as untamable and unownable as the clouds themselves. Our story focuses on the fictional village of Aethelberg, nestled near the river Thame, an area relatively prosperous in the late 12th century. The village possessed a classic post mill, a towering wooden structure whose entire body could be rotated on a central post to face the wind. It was maintained by the parish priest, Father Alaric, who saw his stewardship of the mill as a holy obligation to his flock. "The wind is God's breath, my children," Father Alaric would often preach, his voice echoing in the small stone church. "And can any man charge you for the very air that sustains life? No! The labor is ours, but the power is free." Life in Aethelberg revolved around this freedom. John the plowman would bring his sack of wheat, exchange pleasantries with Alaric's young apprentice Thomas, and in an hour or two he would return with his flour. He owed a small measure, yes, but he did not owe a lord. He did not owe a monopoly. The system worked, sustaining the humble independence of the English farmer. This system, however, was fundamentally an anathema to the rising power of the medieval aristocracy. Chapter 2. The Genius of the Ban and the Burden of the Mill. The genius that would eventually ruin this idyllic freedom was not a technical inventor, but a legal innovator, the local lord. The medieval economy was built on feudal obligation. The lord owned the land, and the serf or tenant was tied to it. The lord wanted to extract maximum profit and control from his holdings. The existence of the quernstone and the free mill represented a massive hole in his feudal revenue stream. Enter the concept of banality, or banal rights, in French droit de banalité. This legal mechanism, which had been slowly evolving on the continent and was now being aggressively imported and enforced by Norman-descended lords in England, was devastatingly simple. The lord claimed ownership of all necessary instruments of communal life, effectively turning free resources into private and compulsory services. The mill was the primary target. The lord would erect his own, grander, more efficient mill, often a sturdy stone tower mill or a large water mill, and then petition the king, or simply declare himself to be the sole purveyor of grinding services within his jurisdiction or manor. This declaration was called the ban of the mill, or mill soak. It was not enough to merely offer the service. The key was the compulsion. The lord would issue a decree of abolition against all other forms of grinding. The decree, posted in the local square or read by the lord's bailiff, made two things clear. The quernstone outlawed. All private hand-operated quernstones were declared illegal, instruments of fraud and theft against the lord's rightful revenues, and anyone caught using one would face a severe penalty, usually confiscation of the stones and a hefty fine. Compulsory thrilgay. Every tenant within the manor was compelled to bring their grain only to the lord's mill. They were then subject to the lord's multure, which was often significantly higher than the traditional customary fee, often taking as much as 1/16 of the total flour. This was the genius of the ban. It wasn't an invention, it was a monopoly enforced by law and violence. The lord, like the most ruthless modern corporation, had eliminated all competition and captured the entire market, ensuring a steady, reliable, and compulsory profit. In Ethelberg, the change arrived not with a bang, but with the clatter of horse hooves and the cold pronouncement of Baron Reginald de Valence. Baron de Valence, a land-hungry nobleman, recently granted the manorial rights over the district, was a man whose ambition was as sharp as the point of a lance. He had recently completed a magnificent multi-wheeled water mill on the River Thame, a marvel of medieval engineering. It was 3 times the size of Father Alaric's old post mill. In the autumn of 1286, the baron's bailiff, a grim-faced man named Peter, rode into Ethelberg with a small contingent of armed men. He didn't bother with a sermon or a friendly appeal. He simply nailed the decree to the church door. The ensuing scene was one of disbelief, then quiet, simmering panic. "What of my quernstone?" cried an old woman, Ilara, whose back was too bent for the walk to the baron's distant mill. Bailiff Peter merely pointed to the decree. "They are now instruments of rebellion. Surrender them to my men by sundown, or face the fine of 5 silver shillings." 5 shillings was an astronomical sum for a poor woman. It was the price of a cow. And what of Father Alaric's beloved post mill, the one that ran on the free, unowned breath of God? That structure is now deemed a common nuisance, an obstruction to the Lord's guaranteed profit. It is to be disassembled, and the stones rendered useless. The Lord will pay the church a nominal fee for the wood and the copper, but the Lord's mill is the only lawful place of grinding. Within a week, the sails of Ethelberg's post mill were taken down, its giant axle removed, and the essential millstones, the runners, were cracked with sledgehammers, rendering them useless. The free wind had been officially privatized.
This was the moment the common man lost his food sovereignty. The freedom to grind was replaced by the duty to grind, and the cost of daily bread became a direct, compulsory tax to the ruling elite. The genius of the baron, the genius of legal monopoly, had ruined the common right for everyone in his manorial jurisdiction. Chapter 3. The Rebellion of the Millstone. The loss of the quernstone, the simple machine that guaranteed a family could eat regardless of the lord's mood or the bailiff's greed, was a bitter pill. But the true genius of the band was the extraction of wealth. The lord's mill was a powerful machine, processing vast quantities of grain quickly. But the increased output came with an increased price, often inflated beyond traditional limits. Moreover, the compulsory nature of the service allowed for blatant, unchecked fraud. The Lord's miller, now a powerful local functionary, was renowned for two key dishonest practices. The short wait. When the peasant presented his sack of grain, the miller would often use a rigged scale or especially large measure to record the initial weight, effectively claiming the peasant brought less grain than he actually did. The heavy mulcher. When assessing the lord's customary cut, the mulcher, the miller would use a cup or bowl with a false bottom or an exaggerated volume, taking more than the legally defined share, or theft of the 13th, the customary share being often around 1/13 of the flour. The medieval term for these dishonest actions was simply miller's thumb, a term that became synonymous with petty tyranny and legalized theft. The peasants of Ethelberg, already chafing under the baron's heavy taxes and labor demands, began to whisper. They recognized the baron's mill was not a service but a taxation engine. Their annual yield, which barely saw them through the winter, was being eaten away by the new exorbitant mulcher. Their children were hungrier than they had been before the baron's gift of the large mill. The anger coalesced around Thomas, the former apprentice of Father Alaric's free mill. Thomas, a sharp-witted young man with calloused hands, had inherited his father's quernstone, a family heirloom hidden beneath the floorboards of his cottage. He remembered the old law. Customary law trumped manorial decree. The band of the mill was a relatively new innovation, imposed by powerful men. But the common rite of grinding was a tradition that stretched back into the mists of Anglo-Saxon law, centuries before the Norman conquest. Thomas began holding secret meetings, not in the inn, which was surely watched, but in the thick, shadowy heart of the Ethelberg woods, beneath the boughs of an ancient oak that predated the baron's family line. They tell us the power of the wind is the baron's, Thomas argued to a small group of farmers one cold November night. But who holds the rope when the sails turn? We do. Who tills the ground for the grain? We do. The baron provides nothing but the decree and the bailiff's whip. His plan was audacious. It was not a violent rebellion against the baron's troops, which would surely end in mass hanging. It was a rebellion of technology and law. He needed two things: a new mill, a grinding stone that operated outside the traditional definitions of the mill soak, something that could not be easily declared a nuisance or private quern. A legal champion, someone to argue their case in the manor court, and perhaps even higher in the king's courts at Westminster, invoking the ancient common law against the new manorial statute. Thomas had an idea for the first, the treadmill mill. A rotating device, normally used for lifting water or turning a lathe, could be adapted to turn a small, hidden set of grinding stones. It would be powered not by wind or water, but by the relentless, hidden labor of man and beast. He would build it secretly in an abandoned, disused sheep-shearing shed, and the peasants would bring their grain under the cover of darkness. But the second need was met by an unexpected ally. Lady Eleanor de Valence, the Baron's long-suffering wife, was a woman of deep piety and surprisingly advanced learning. She had a keen, almost subversive interest in historical law, believing the old English customary rights were often more just than the brutal decrees of her Norman-descended husband. Having witnessed the poverty and misery the ban of the mill had brought to Ethelberg, she began to take a dangerous interest in the farmer's plight. Lady Eleanor knew the legal vulnerability of the Baron's ban was its definition. The decrees typically outlawed hand querns, small and personal, and public mills, large, wind or water-powered. Thomas's hidden, labor-powered treadmill mill existed in a legal gray area. It was neither a simple hand quern nor a traditional power mill. The battle for the freedom to grind grain was shifting from the field to the courtroom, and the weapon was not a sword, but a technicality. The genius that ruined it, the Baron's legal monopoly, would now be challenged by a genius of evasion and a courageous lady. The full story would continue with Thomas successfully building and operating his secret treadmill mill, the Baron's ruthless attempts to find the pirate mill, Lady Eleanor's covert guidance on legal arguments, the eventual court challenge, and the unexpected political fallout that exposed the ban of the mill as an engine of oppression, leading to a temporary, localized restoration of the common right, before a later, more powerful genius, the Industrial Revolution, would permanently end this common freedom. This detailed opening of approximately 2,000 words sets the historical scene, introduces the conflict, the loss of the common right of grinding, identifies the genius, the legal invention of the ban of the mill by the feudal lord, and establishes the narrative hook for the American audience, themes of liberty, monopolistic corporate power, and legal resistance.
The Whispering Wheels. The abandoned sheep-shearing shed stood half a mile outside Ethelberg, cloaked by a dense thicket of hawthorn and elder. It was a ruin, deliberately neglected by Thomas's father years ago, and mercifully ignored by the Baron's rent collector, who considered it worthless. It was here, under the cloak of deepest midnight, that Thomas and his closest confidants, John the Ploughman, the silent widow Martha, and young Ben, whose keen eyes served as the group's best lookout, began their work. The construction of the treadmill mill was a study in ingenious necessity. They did not have the heavy iron gears of the Baron's official mill, nor the vast wind-catching sails of the old post mill. They had wood, ropes, and the precious salvaged stones from Father Alaric's mill, which Thomas had meticulously repaired and rebalanced, a task of staggering precision. The heart of the new mill was the power source, a massive wooden tread wheel. Imagine a gigantic hamster wheel, nearly 10 feet in diameter. It was designed to be turned by either a harnessed oxen, when they could risk borrowing one under heavy blankets, or, more often, by the men themselves. The process demanded secrecy and silence. First, they dug down. The grinding mechanism and the finished flour bins were placed in a cellar beneath the shed, accessible only by a trap door hidden beneath straw. This prevented the telltale plume of flour dust from escaping into the air and attracting unwanted attention. Second, they perfected the sound dampening. The rhythmic thump, thump of the tread wheel was muffled by layers of heavy woolen blankets scavenged from old bedding. The grinding stones themselves, the source of the high-pitched, shushing sound of milling, were enclosed in a heavy, custom-built wooden box stuffed with straw and moss. The treadmill mill became known among the villagers only as the Whispering Wheel. Operating the Whispering Wheel was arduous. It required 2 men to walk inside the giant wheel for an hour, their muscles burning, their breath coming in ragged gasps, to grind enough flour for 6 families. But it offered 2 priceless commodities: freedom and security. Freedom from the baron's exorbitant multure. They charged a flat fee, just enough to cover oil for the axles and the occasional bribe to a local shepherd to keep quiet. Security from the miller's thumb. Every peasant watched their grain weighed accurately and their flour measured fairly. The first month of operation was a terrifying success. Under the shadow of the moon, small groups of villagers, their faces hidden in hoods, would trek to the shed, sometimes carrying their grain on their backs, sometimes using a heavily muffled cart. They spoke in whispers, exchanging sacks of wheat for sacks of flour, participating in a quiet, collective act of economic disobedience. Baron de Valence, meanwhile, noticed the shortfall in his ledgers. Chapter 5. The Baron's Fury and the Lady's Warning. Baron Reginald de Valence was not a fool. He was a tyrant, yes, but an efficient one. His mill revenues were down by nearly 20%, a massive dip that meant fewer falcons for his hobby and less wine for his table. He summoned his miller, a sweaty, nervous man named Giles, and his bailiff, Peter. "Explain this deficit, Giles," the Baron demanded, his voice dangerously low as he gestured toward the ledger in his solar. "Are the farmers starving? Is the harvest poor?" "No, my lord. The harvest was fine, but the grain simply isn't coming. The women complain their husbands are using the hand querns again, despite the threat of the fine." "Then fine them. Confiscate the stones. Hang a few as a deterrent," the Baron roared, slamming his fist onto the oak table. Bailiff Peter, who had been aggressively pursuing the quernstone ban, intervened cautiously. "My lord, we have confiscated perhaps 20 stones, but still the revenue drops. I suspect, my lord, that it is not the simple quernstone. Those are too small to make such a difference. Someone is operating a pirate mill." The word pirate ignited the Baron's fury. A pirate mill was not just theft, it was a direct challenge to his authority, a sign that the peasants did not fear the ban. He tripled the patrols, ordering his men to listen for the distinctive sounds of grinding, the clatter, the whoosh, the low hum. He offered a large reward in silver to any tenant who betrayed the location of the illegal mill. His search, however, was fruitless. The patrols listened near the rivers, anticipating a hidden water wheel. They waited on the hilltops, expecting the sighting of the illegal sails. They never thought to listen for the faint, muffled sounds of human labor in a disused shed far from the common thoroughfare.
Meanwhile, Lady Eleanor de Valence watched the escalating crisis with growing dread and determination. She was the one true scholar in the household, spending hours poring over dusty Latin texts on canon law and ancient charters. She saw the Baron's monopoly not just as cruel, but as legally vulnerable. The key, she realized, lay in the wording of the ban. Late one night, under the guise of requesting Thomas, a known carpenter before becoming a rebel, to repair a loose shutter, Lady Eleanor met him near the manor stables. "Thomas, you are risking the gallons for the sake of flour.
she whispered urgently, her eyes darting nervously toward the castle keep. "We risk starvation otherwise, my lady," Thomas replied simply. Eleanor handed him a carefully copied parchment. It was not a recipe or a prayer, but a legal excerpt, an old charter of liberties from the time of Henry II. "Your mill," she murmured, "is not illegal yet. The Baron's decree outlaws all mills driven by the current of river or the wind of the heavens, and all personal hand-querns. How is your mill driven, Thomas?" "By the feet of men and the power of oxen, my lady." "Excellent," she breathed, her voice tight with adrenaline. "It is neither. It is a beast-driven engine, a device of labor, not of nature's flow. You must ensure the bailiff sees it as such. If the Baron ever catches you, you must not deny the mill. You must argue the technicality." She outlined her plan. The Baron would eventually find the mill. When he did, the peasants must immediately file a legal counter-petition in the manor court, citing the ancient customary right against the modern manorial ban and using the technical definition of the treadmill mill as their defense. "The Baron believes his decree is ironclad. Show him that even the law has cracks. But you must be ready. He will find you." Chapter 6. The Confrontation at the Whispering Wheel. Lady Eleanor's prophecy proved grimly accurate. The Baron had exhausted his patience. He had started threatening the children of suspected families. The fear was reaching a boiling point. In the first week of spring, a nervous peasant named Walter, whose sickly child needed expensive medicine, succumbed to the lure of the silver reward. He stumbled into the Baron's court, shivering, and pointed toward the direction of the old shearing shed. The raid was swift and brutal. Baron de Valence, Bailiff Peter, and 10 mounted men-at-arms descended upon the shed in the early morning fog. Thomas, John, and Martha were inside, just finishing a batch of rye flour. They heard the thunder of hooves too late. The men-at-arms smashed the door in. The sight that greeted the Baron was astonishing. The massive, still-turning treadwheel, the flour dust hanging in the air, the massive stone runners, and the weary, flour-covered faces of the peasants. The Baron erupted in a fury of triumph. "Aha! The pirate mill! The engine of treason! Confiscate the grain! Arrest these traitors!" He stood over Thomas, the bailiff holding a torch high. "You have defied my decree, Thomas. You have built a mill to steal from your lord. The rope awaits you." Thomas, though his heart hammered, remembered Eleanor's frantic instructions. He did not beg. He did not deny the mill. "My Lord Baron, I deny the theft, and I deny the treason. This is no pirate mill, my lord, for it is not a mill as defined in your decree." Baron de Valence actually paused, confused by the peasant's boldness. "It is grinding grain. It is a mill." "It is an engine of labor, my lord. Your decree forbids the mill of the water and the mill of the wind. It forbids the personal hand-quern. This device," he gestured to the massive treadwheel, "is powered by the forced labor of the beast and man. It is a simple tool of the field, just like a plow or a harrow." Bailiff Peter scowled, sensing the legal trap. "It is grinding flour." "And a mortar and pestle grind spices, bailiff, yet you do not find the cook. This machine is powered by our sweat, not God's wind. It is a device of private labor, not of public force. It is a lawful contraption, my lord, built by us to escape your unjust 16th multure and the thieving fingers of your miller Giles." Thomas's final insult, throwing Giles's corruption back into the Baron's face, was a calculated risk. But the Baron was now distracted not by anger, but by the legal implications. Thomas was invoking the old Anglo-Saxon common law, the right to use one's own labor to sustain one's family, against the Baron's new aggressive Norman manorial ban. The Baron could not simply hang them. Thomas had articulated a defense of legality, not merely desperation. "Peter, take them to the jail, confiscate the stones," the baron commanded. "But do not destroy the wooden wheel. I want the royal justice summoned. This peasant will be crushed, not by the rope, but by the weight of the law itself." Thomas and the others were dragged away, but the villagers who watched the scene knew Thomas had won a small, vital victory. They were not just criminals, they were now litigants with a claim. The battle for the freedom to grind grain was now officially headed to the terrifying, unpredictable arena of the manor court. The trial by technicality. The manor court was less a hall of justice and more the baron's intimidating dining room, hastily rearranged. Baron de Valence sat enthroned on a high-backed chair, flanked by Bailiff Peter, who served as the prosecutor, and 3 landholders, local farmers loyal to the baron, who were coerced into acting as the jury, or homagers. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale ale and the chilling certainty of predetermined guilt. Thomas and his co-accused stood before the baron, their clothing dusty and their faces grim. The charges were clear: theft of revenue, violation of the mill ban, and sedition against the Lord's authority. Bailiff Peter opened the prosecution by delivering a scathing theatrical denouncement. "My Lord Baron," Peter declared, pointing an accusing finger at Thomas, "these men, led by this seditious carpenter, have committed a grievous sin against the feudal contract. They sought to profit from the Lord's granted rights by operating a hidden mill. They have stolen the multure due to you, and in doing so, they have undermined the very stability of this manor. This whispering wheel, as they call it, is nothing more than a quernstone of enormous size built to evade your just decree. It is a fraud against the manorial law." The argument was simple. The baron's law made it any means of grinding grain outside the Lord's mill illegal, regardless of the power source. The treadmill was a malicious evasion, and therefore treasonous. The homagers nodded along, eager to please the baron. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he was surprisingly calm. He had spent his time in the dark jail cell mentally rehearsing the argument Lady Eleanor had provided, focusing on the precise legal language. "My Lord Baron and honored homagers," he began, bowing his head respectfully to the baron, but focusing his gaze on the jury. "I make no denial that we ground grain. That is fact. But the law, my lord, is not written in emotion, but in precise words. Your decree, published and known to all, explicitly forbids 2 things: the mill driven by water or wind, the public mills, and the quern driven by hand, the private personal stone. This is the sum of the ban." Thomas paused, allowing the silence to stretch. "My lord, the device we built is driven not by the currents of nature, but by the legs of men, and at times the strength of oxen. It is a machine of labor, like a wine press or a cider mill, tools which are common and lawful for every peasant to own and operate." He then delivered the argument Lady Eleanor had specifically honed. "Your decree, my lord, sought to capture the forces of nature and the simplest of tools. It did not seek to outlaw the common, honest labor of a man or his beast. If I use a horse to turn a wheel to mix my bread dough, is that treason? No. Our mill is a device of labor, and to forbid the free peasant to employ his own labor for his own food is to challenge a custom older than any Norman king, the common right to sustainment." This was a brilliant legal move. Thomas wasn't arguing that the baron's ban was unjust. He was arguing that the baron's clerks had been incompetent in writing it. The ban had failed to explicitly include mills powered by man or beast. The baron had missed a technicality, and in medieval law, technicalities were everything. The homagers began to look uneasy. They understood the difference Thomas was drawing. They knew that outlawing all forms of labor-powered machinery was too sweeping. It would halt half the daily activities of the manor. The intervention of the learned. Just as Bailiff Peter prepared to counter-argue, pointing out that the intent of the law was to outlaw all competition, a discreet sound at the edge of the room interrupted the proceedings, the rustle of silk. Lady Eleanor de Valence entered the room, holding a heavy volume bound in cracked dark leather. Her presence was utterly unprecedented and instantly quieted the room. The Baron looked stunstruck. His wife never involved herself in manorial business. "My lord husband," she said, her voice carrying a soft, learned authority, "I beg your pardon, but I have been studying the royal charter granted to your ancestor, which establishes this manorial court and its powers of jurisdiction." She walked toward the Baron's table, ignoring Peter's hostile stare, and opened the large book. "The charter states that this court shall judge based on manorial law, but only where manorial law does not violate the fundamental customary rights of the realm." She cleared her throat. "The customary right for a free man to use his labor to produce food for his family, provided that labor does not infringe upon the common weal, such as polluting the stream or obstructing the road, is sacrosanct. Furthermore," she continued, gazing down at the bailiff, "legal history shows that courts have repeatedly struck down manorial decrees that are overbroad, meaning they try to outlaw more than they are legally allowed. The royal courts hold that a ban on a windmill cannot be interpreted to include a hand mill. Why then should it be interpreted to include a labor mill?" Lady Eleanor's intervention was not just a legal argument. It was a political threat. By referencing the fundamental customary rights and the royal courts, she was suggesting that if the Baron convicted Thomas, the case would be appealed to a higher court, a process that would cost the Baron ruinous sums of money, expose his greed, and quite possibly result in the king overturning his ban entirely. "Silence!" the Baron roared, addressing the court. He looked at the homagers, whose faces now reflected open confusion and fear of the Baron and the royal law. "The court finds," the Baron announced, his voice tight with controlled rage, "that the prisoner, Thomas, and his accomplices, while clearly attempting to evade the spirit of the law, did not, by the narrow and unfortunate definitions set forth in my decree, violate the letter of the mill ban." A collective, silent gasp of disbelief swept the room. "The charge of violation of the mill ban is dismissed. However," he added, spinning the verdict to save face, "the use of the shed for illicit unauthorized activity and the appropriation of my timber for construction constitutes trespass and damage to property." The verdict was a brilliant, face-saving compromise. Thomas was acquitted of the capital crime of treason, sedition, but convicted of a petty crime. The sentence was, "Thomas and his men shall serve 2 months of hard labor in the Baron's fields, and the whispering wheel shall be dismantled, but the millstones shall be returned to the villagers for private use." It was a staggering victory. The millstones, the very tools of grinding, were saved. The Baron had been forced to concede the legal point. He had failed to outlaw the labor mill. While the specific treadmill was lost, the precedent was set. A device powered by man or beast was not subject to the ban. The freedom was not entirely restored, as they still had to build a new, smaller mill, but the genius of the Baron's monopoly had been shattered by the genius of legal evasion backed by the learned courage of Lady Eleanor. The people of Athelberg had won the right to grind their own grain, provided they provided the effort themselves. The wind and water were still the barons, but the power of human labor was now undeniably free.
The diffusion of freedom. Thomas's victory, though resulting in 2 months of hard labor, was the equivalent of a peasant revolution won by a legal footnote. The news of the labor mill precedent, that a man or beast-powered mill was exempt from the ban of the mill, did not travel on paper, but on the tongues of traveling merchants, wandering friars, and returning pilgrims. Across England, from the Midlands to the Welsh marches, the peasantry, inspired by the tale of Ethelberg, began to seize their newfound technical freedom. The rise of the labor mills. The treadmill mill proved to be the ideal device for this decentralized resistance. While it was back-breakingly difficult to operate, requiring immense human energy, it possessed key advantages that guaranteed its rapid diffusion. Low barrier to entry. It required only basic carpentry skills, wood, and salvaged or newly hewn millstones. Unlike a water mill, it needed no expensive masonry or complex dam construction. Unlike a windmill, it didn't require acres of land and massive timber posts. Secrecy. It could be built indoors, away from the prying eyes of the baron's patrols. Legal immunity. As Thomas had proven, the power source, human and animal muscle, was considered a lawful asset of the peasant, not a commodity of nature owned by the lord. Within 5 years, Baron Reginald de Valence's revenue from his great watermill had plummeted by over half. Other lords faced similar catastrophic losses. The genius that had ruined the common right, the legal monopoly enforced by the mill ban, was now being checkmated by the genius of peasant legal evasion and appropriate technology. The lords were outraged. They tried several countermeasures. The second ban. New, updated decrees were issued, frantically attempting to outlaw all grinding of grain not performed at the lord's mill, regardless of the device's power source. The royal intervention. The barons pooled their influence and appealed to the king, arguing that the labor mills were threatening the stability of the feudal economy, which they were. For a time, the king was sympathetic to the lords, who were, after all, his chief military and financial supporters. But the tide of common law and customary rights was surprisingly strong. When a new case reached the royal courts, the king's judges, wary of setting a precedent that outlawed all forms of peasant ingenuity, often favored the logic established in the Ethelberg Compromise. They ruled that while the lord had the right to own the natural forces, wind and water, he did not have the right to own the labor of his subjects. The result was a glorious, albeit temporary, resurgence of food sovereignty. Farmers regained control over their primary resource. They no longer feared the miller's thumb, and the quality of their daily bread improved instantly. The cost of living dropped, and a small measure of independence returned to the English countryside. Thomas, now a legend, used his woodworking skills to travel between villages, not as a carpenter, but as a consultant, helping peasants build their own whispering wheels and prepare their legal defenses. Lady Eleanor, from within the castle walls, continued to send him anonymous, coded legal advice written on scraps of parchment wrapped around loaves of bread. A quiet, powerful partnership that defied the feudal hierarchy. This period, from approximately 1290 to 1750, marked a long, slow oscillation. Lords would try to enforce the ban, peasants would build labor mills, court cases would follow, and often the peasant would win the technicality. The freedom to grind one's own grain, achieved through sheer, grueling human effort, survived for centuries.
But history rarely allows the underdog to keep their victory forever. The final, ultimate genius that would crush this freedom was not a legal inventor, but a mechanical one. and the resulting economic shift would be irreversible. The genius that ended all free things. The centuries passed. The medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, then the Enlightenment. Kings were executed, empires rose, and the power of the landed baron slowly gave way to the power of the merchant and the industrialist. The common right to grind, though legally protected in many pockets, was already under pressure from the massive manor mills, which had become sophisticated, capital-intensive operations run by powerful corporations or wealthy gentry. These mills operated on a scale that made the poor peasant's treadmill look pitifully inefficient. They could produce flour faster and, in purely bulk terms, cheaper than any man-powered operation. The final blow to the common right was delivered not by a legal decree, but by a machine, the most pivotal invention of the Industrial Revolution, and its inventor, Richard Arkwright. Arkwright was a barber turned inventor. He didn't initially focus on milling, but on spinning cotton. His most significant innovation, however, was not the spinning frame itself, but his revolutionary system of factory production powered by the water frame and later the steam engine. Richard Arkwright and the privatization of power. Arkwright's genius lay in recognizing that the new machines could not only do the work of thousands of hands, but could also turn the forces of nature, water, then steam, into a privatized, centralized, and constantly available source of energy. Before Arkwright, the power of water or wind was mostly stationary or decentralized. You built a mill on a riverbank. Arkwright created the template for the modern, centralized factory, where power was concentrated and controlled entirely by the owner. The Arkwright model, once perfected for cotton, was quickly adapted for grain. Massive scale. The new steam-powered roller mills were gargantuan, producing flour at thousands of times the speed and scale of even the largest medieval watermill. They used steel rollers instead of stones, producing finer, whiter flour, which soon became the desired status symbol. Unbeatable efficiency. The sheer scale and speed of the steam engine meant that the cost per pound of flour, despite the capital investment, dropped far below the cost of human labor. The death of effort. Why would a farmer spend 3 exhausting hours in a dark shed turning a treadwheel when he could pay a few pennies for a bag of perfect, white flour from the industrial mill? The sheer effort required for the common right, the very thing that had saved it in 1286, now killed it in 1786. The genius of Thomas and Lady Eleanor had won the legal battle, but Arkwright's genius had rendered the victory irrelevant. The new industrial mill didn't need a ban. It simply outcompeted the freedom out of existence. The common right to grinding did not die by force or by law. It died by convenience and efficiency. The free choice to mill your own grain, requiring painful effort, became an absurd choice when faced with the ease and low price of the industrial product. The finality of the loss. By the early 19th century, the old mill bans were effectively meaningless, forgotten relics of a feudal age. The labor mills fell silent. The treadwheels rotted in abandoned sheds, and the precious quernstones that had been hidden for centuries were sold as paving stones or simply discarded. The thing that was once free, the ability to provide your own food security using your own hands and your own communal effort, was permanently lost, replaced by the dependency on a massive, centralized industrial supply chain. The genius that ruined the free right was, in the end, the technological and economic genius that gave birth to the modern age. Richard Arkwright's system of centralized, mechanized, and overwhelming efficiency. It solved the problem of hunger and toil, but in doing so, it created a new modern servitude, the complete reliance on the factory owner and the market price, forever ending the common man's power to sustain himself by his own free labor. The villagers of Ethelberg, now factory workers or indebted farmers, bought their flour from a mill powered by the fire and smoke of industry, owing allegiance not to a baron, but to the invisible, relentless force of the capital market. The wind and the water were free, yes, but the massive privatized power source that mattered, the steam engine, was owned, and with that ownership, the last vestige of food freedom passed into history.